And I'm also going to provide the link for the SFU Vault is the link where this is also. So have we all arrived? How are we doing? We have.
It feels like such a big question. Have we arrived?
Have we arrived? Yeah, exactly. And you know, in a session like this, it has all those multiple meanings, right?
Exactly.
So welcome, welcome. What I would like to do is just briefly introduce myself and then also Samantha, because we'll be holding the space together in terms of trying to both share some just launching thoughts and then also collect up and harvest the thinking that we're doing so that we can share it back to the big group as we did in the morning session. And then I just want to invite you to think about whether you're the person or whether there's a few people in here who want to do that reporting back process, working from Samantha's notes, so that we have a few more voices here in this session. So no need to choose that and answer that question now, but just sending out that invitation is something to think about if you really feel like that's you who wants to share. So yes, indeed. So I'm Maya Gislason. I'm here at Simon Fraser University and have been thinking about the content and the space of this Summer Institute for several months now. So it is a very special thing to be able to come together and share in this moment with you now. I wonder, Samantha, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself and what you're doing here in the session.
Sure. So my name's Samantha, or you can call me Sam or Sammy. I am an epidemiologist who works for the government of Yukon, so I'm joining you from Whitehorse. I've had the pleasure of being on the scientific planning committee for the PHABC Summer Institute for 2 years in a row now. And so I will do my best to capture the conversation, take notes, summarize on the slides. I was a bit fumbly last time with the One Health one, so hopefully I'll organize my thoughts a little bit better this time around. But yeah, that's sort of my role in all of this.
Thank you so much. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to move into the slides. And then I always think it's very strange to not hear from everybody, especially in a session like today. But let's begin here. And that is with a land acknowledgement. And Sandra, I see you're here, and we're so blessed to have you. The profound connection that you brought to the beginning of this day is still with me. And I just want to acknowledge that this work that I'm presenting from where I sit anyways, and we're all sitting on different traditional territories, is of the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And the more I'm here living and learning and working, I come to understand and educate myself as an uninvited guest and settler about the presence that's been here since time immemorial, that is here now and that will continue to be here. And we see that so much, for example, even with the Kinder Morgan pipeline protests and so on, that this is an ethic of care, of being caretakers and stewards of the land. And I learn a lot about that. And I wanted to also just invite that whether we're here on this land by choice, by force, by displacement, we're born here, we've been here for many generations, being settlers and immigrants here means that we are bound by the treaties of this land, and I think about that a lot, about what it means to be accountable to that. And also partly that many of these treaties have been broken and ignored by the Canadian government. And this has led to land theft and systemic colonization and violence and genocide. And when we're thinking about how to reorient and move forward, you know, these are really things that we have to think about in terms of what's going on in the present moment. And then and what it takes to kind of unlearn and relearn and build new ways of thinking and working together that are based in different kinds of ethics and orientations, ones of respect and commitment to deep system change, to gratitude for all who have come before, to the land, the stories, and all the diverse nations that are here. So I really wanted to just begin with that awareness and locate ourselves here. I also wanted to take a moment to kind of name that contradiction a little bit about wanting to think about ecological feminism, trying to orient that work to being on unceded traditional territories, and then even to think about the terms and the legacies of those terms. And for example, when we talk about feminism or women's, the kind of dominant conceptualization of women, we are invoking Western gender norms. We're invoking colonial constructs and legacies. And I think that part of the tension in the work we're going to do, thinking and speaking together today, is holding both the huge problematics of that, but also holding the celebration of much more inclusive and expansive thinking about bodies and genders and gender identities that come from Indigenous cultures on Turtle Island, and that we don't have to be bound by these binaries, for example. And I also wanted to say that even though I'm trained in, you know, feminist thought, coming through that work in university settings, I'm not going to talk about feminist history as it's often taught, because in a sense that's also a colonial move, but rather to celebrate the fact that this movement around being women, working on fighting against patriarchy and these kinds of forces have been going on for hundreds of years in terms of Indigenous women's resistance to colonization, and thousands of years in terms of how women have been exercising spiritual and economic and political power on these lands. So that's kind of some orienting thinking I wanted to offer. So what I'm doing here is just offering a few invitations to thought, and really what the focus of this session I invite it to be about anyways is exploring some of these key ideas that do get talked about and articulated within the ecological feminist frame, and that are being unpacked and reframed in terms of work coming from Black, Indigenous, and other women of color's feminist movements, and to think about the question about what are some of the key implications for our collective action that arise when we think through these feminist lenses. I wanted to, for a moment, just also frame how I think about feminism, and I invoke Bell Hooks here, who's on the left-hand side of your screens, and she is saying, you know, feminism is this politics where we try and begin our engagement and reframing of power by looking at sexism and patriarchy, and those are points of entry, and they're not the places that we stop. And she also gives this idea that feminism can have a really bad name and a bad rap. And partly that's because it's patriarchal mass media that's defining the terms and and situating ourselves discursively and socially and culturally in relation to these terms. So I just want to invoke that, and also to acknowledge that throughout this talk, we're going to talk a lot about intersectionality in terms of the words I'll share that come from Kimberly Crenshaw, who acknowledges that these terms come from many of the Black women who were her grandmothers and grandmothers' grandmothers who fought against these very white supremacist violent traditions of kind of Western colonial practices. And so she is troubling and connecting privilege and oppression in ways that are very useful to us. And so when we think about feminism through an intersectional framework, I think we're accepting that it's not easy to talk about, it's not an easy process. It requires doing hard work. It requires trying to understand what it's like to be someone who is other than ourselves, and to engage in closing that gap in empathy rather than othering practices. And so then what is ecofeminism? What do I mean about that? Well, really, it's this idea that throughout time, women have been developing theories and practices which decenter politics of domination, which center ethics of creating egalitarian, collaborative, and equitable societies. And they do that at the heart of really seeing the connection between humans and animals in the natural world. And so we can talk about ecofeminism in this way. We can link back to Western traditions. We can move beyond it, back into deep traditions of indigenous cultures and peoples. But what we're trying to do, I think for me anyways, is bring these traditions together to talk about institutionalization of violences and systemic oppressions. And so the current era around feminism is really trying to do this linking, to try and link Indigenous peoples' rights, human rights, gender equity, and so on. And that's sort of the impulse and the effort that I want to foreground. And I also want to just invite and invoke into our space the profound work that is coming from young feminists who are trying to fight both for changes, for example, to how we are dealing with the Earth system, so climate activists, and also who are trying to link issues of sexism and racism and poverty and inequity, these structural dimensions. And so we have a picture of Greta here and protests. And so this is the feeling of what ecofeminism looks like in this current moment. And of course, we're invoking the work of Black feminists who have been raising to our fore the interconnection between trying to understand the relations of domination to the Earth through the lens of racial inequity and discrimination and violence, and the rich tradition of theorizing and insight that comes from this work as well. So taking us back again to this notion of tackling structural inequities as part of the ecofeminist impulse. And this is wonderful work that comes, for example, this idea of Black lungs matter as well, coming out of the UK in 2016, where Black intersectional ecofeminists shut down airports in London and other cities to show the connections between racism and ecocide. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that in the space of the Anthropocene as well, there are wonderful critiques coming, work that's trying to bring feminism and feminist theory into the notion of the Anthropocene, to queer theories around the Anthropocene, to critique ideas of collapsing back into notions of a manthropocene, where we're very much recentering you know, the male gaze and the Western kind of way of being technocratic and so on. So Anthropocene feminism is a thing, and it is a very interesting and exciting way of engaging in these spaces as well. And it's an effort to try and create, as this review suggests, a more sophisticated feminist ecology for the current moment. So things that I want to invite us to think about are, how might ecofeminism, in the kinds of ways that I'm suggesting we might think about it, help us to fight climate change and the destruction of the environment? And maybe fight isn't the right word, but reimagine, engage with, shift, and transform might be words that are more akin to the kind of spirit that we're talking about here. Some believe that ecofeminists can contribute to eradicating forms of oppression, which are still systemically upheld through social relations of domination, through patriarchy, racism, and rampant industrialization and others. So what do we think about that? And what happens when we encourage healthier attitudes towards people and the planet? And how can ecofeminist impulses or theories or orientations be combined with, for example, indigenous ways of understanding and being on the land, with the land, stewarding another kind of sustainability? And how can we kind of shift dominant culture in terms of respect for the land and our relationship to it? And so I guess if I was going to summarize a question that we might begin to engage around, it might be, what are some key implications and opportunities for collective action that arise when thinking through this lens of ecological feminism? So really, these were just little words of thought, and invitations for engagement, for refutation, for critique, for building on whatever comes to mind. And I just wanted to ask, when you share, if you would share your name and a little bit about you, if you feel like it, just because I feel like it's being together and sharing our thoughts together, and who we are and what we bring to these conversations is very important. So those are my beginning thoughts for you. And I'd like to turn the floor over to you now to see what arises. I'll also say that I'm going to stop sharing my screen, because I think that then, Samantha, you can potentially share your screen.
Sure.
And take time. I'm a big fan of silence and thinking and reflection, so I'm happy for us to just be here.
Can you see my screen now?
I can.
My notes?
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if, admittedly, I'm not super well versed in this area, but I see a lot of connections. And when I think about, you know, I think about climate change and impacts on the environment, it's hard not to think about the role of economic growth in all of that. And infinitely, you know, we live in this system that's built on infinite growth as the foundation, which we know is unsustainable. And that's also what's led to increasing greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation, loss of ecological systems that would actually protect us against some of the effects of climate change. And then I think about how the economic system is still, in essence, built on the backs of women who do the majority of unpaid labor. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how ecological feminism might play into, you know, this upstream shift that would help address both, you know, how our economic system contributes to environmental degradation, but also contributes to the continued essentially oppression of women.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I think also if we can figure out how to deal with our the kind of economic domination of super capitalism and neoliberalism, and for example, that we're really we're really going to be in good shape. From a feminist theoretical point of view, even ecofeminism has been imagined in different ways. Some ecofeminists, a lot of you know, white second wave feminists thought a lot about the interconnection between women is close to nature and nature is close to women, and focused a lot on kind of I guess spiritual notions around that, but didn't have very much of an economic critique. But there were feminists coming out of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s who really linked understanding just exactly what you're talking about, the relationship between women and the planet, and the exploitation of women and the planet in very concrete ways. Vandana Shiva, coming out of India, was one of the people who was really showing that, you know, the environmental degradation and exploitation of women were very linked. I think part of it is really naming all these things. And I find a lot, even in my classrooms, when I do this linking between the exploitation of the environment and women's time, bodies, caregiving labor, emotional labor, work, you know, undervalued, underpaid workforce labor, and so on. A lot of people can kind of shame and trivialize those kinds of connections, as if we shouldn't really be talking about it anymore, that was something that we should have dealt with a long time ago. And then equally, that those conversations have not had strong enough anti-colonial analyses, white supremacist analyses, in order to understand how this articulates intersectionally with Black women, women of color, Indigenous women, and so on. So I'm just speaking around the topic because I want to convey this idea that that it's still quite a radical thing to make the connections and then to demand change on them, even though it seems like we shouldn't have to keep doing this anymore. But I wonder what other people think.
Hi, my name's Nancy Poole. I'm a researcher who leads a research center on women's health that's based at BC Women's Hospital. And it's a policy research center, not a clinical one. I was one of those early eco-feminists that you've written there didn't look at the economic element, but I really disagree with that. I feel like we were a collection of feminists, many of them focused on capitalism, many of them focused mostly on patriarchy, many focused on nature, etc. And I feel like those early days of feminism, because I'm one of those people, in the sense of second wave in Toronto and Canada, joined up together a lot more. Feminism was much more a multi-group of different kinds of feminists who weren't competitive with each other, but more were just trying to focus on different aspects. And, you know, I heard an interview or a Facebook group the other day of some lesbians from Vancouver who were talking about the early days of pushing for lesbian rights, and how one day we were out protesting about racism, and the next day we were out on the picket line for some worker related thing, and then, you know, we were forming Pride and whatever, and it all was a kind of a solidarity movement rather than something that was more about identity politics or something. And so I feel like the way you introduced it today was so wonderful, because it connected back to that idea that all these feminists and feminisms were building, and I think along the way, the eco-feminist piece kind of slid a little bit too low to the bottom relative to the others. And I feel we're at such a moment now, and for many of the things that we've heard today, that it's really important for us to get back to this place of seeing the economic, the patriarchal, the racist, all these, the environmental pieces, all being things that we need to join up together and work on. And, you know, I feel like a few times I've tried to interact, for instance, with the Canadian Centre on Policy Alternatives when they're looking at big oil or something, and tried to say, you know what, there's not enough feminism in your analysis, right? And, you know, I want to join you and contribute that, but they couldn't see a way to that. And I guess I feel like this is a great moment for us to be able to say, you know, we have a lot to offer about how to link up resistance to the isms that, you know, that really could contribute to an ecological analysis and you know, a contribution to nature and what we need to do there.
Nancy, I appreciate so much what you've said, and I think it is so important. And it's also important to hear the living stories of the history of feminism, because they are very different than the way the textbooks and literature generally portrays it. And I remember interviewing, doing an oral lesbian histories project of the Building of Change building in Victoria, BC, where Clayoquot Sound protests were done. And there was, you know, it was cheap rent. So the environmentalists, the women's organizations, the children's, you know, childcare organizations, the food security organizations, they were all in the same building, moving between floors and offices and working together. Yeah. And it's true, when ecofeminism, it falls to the bottom even of the feminist pile. And I'm my feeling about that is because it links the environment or ecology and women, and we are so habituated in our Western culture to devaluing that. And I'm very concerned that feminism is such a dirty word right now in our cultural moment, and that somehow it being a definition for a deep critique of power and power structures and power inequities and structural violence has been disarticulated from the issue of that way of doing structural change. And that's not to say it's been perfect. It has been problematic, but I think that is part of the opportunity for relearning, unlearning, trying again, and so on.
Yeah, so neat. And, you know, when I think about the Clayoquot Sound resistance and I think of Starhawk, right, as one of the key feminist thinkers who was and could be seen as an eco-feminist amongst many other wonderful things that she is. But her vision of leadership with the crow and the snake and the dragon and all those images, you know, I still refer to a lot today, and I see in the different young researchers I employ, oh, I see her as one of the crows, you know, and I never say it out loud because I think they'll think I'm a crazy old spiritual person or something, but I just feel like there's so much important things that happen there. And in the days when feminism was a much more multifaceted movement about power, as you say, a really important piece for us to think about. And, you know, I was one of the people in Toronto in the 70s who organized an occupation of Ontario to resist the Darlington nuclear plant. And I and a bunch of other mothers and children went in to Ontario Hydro building and ate peanut butter sandwiches at lunch with all our little signs about this. And it never made any news. It's never been in any feminist history book I've seen, but it was, I think it was so fundamentally shocking to them that women and children would come and eat lunch in protest in their building, that they absolutely didn't know what to do. They didn't get the police to toss us out, or they didn't do anything to acknowledge it or change or whatever. But I feel like there's so many great movements of nuggets that we need to build on at this point.
Thank you. So here's my daughter. So so I am glad as we begin this conversation that we come kind of into the circle together. So bringing in your voice, Nancy, and that kind of history of feminism is one of those voices. So, you know, welcome. And I'm wondering what other perspectives and experiences there, and they might also be contradictory or complementary. But what else comes to mind, both in terms of, I guess, your relationship to this notion and these terms of feminism and ecological feminism, but also what can this kind of approach to critiquing and trying to protest and change structural violence and domination offer to work on the Anthropocene?
It's Maureen Rowan, and I'm a retired public health nurse and co-chair for the Capacity Building Committee. And I was just reading an article about how in Denmark they've put in laws regarding climate change and using wording that is palatable to everyone. I think wording is a big deal, and so that people understand what it is and so there isn't a pushback because though the language, I don't understand that or I interpret it differently. And one of the things that they were talking about in this article is an enduring solution, because things seem to go this way and that way. And I think what the fellow was talking about in the previous session about being agile to deal with crazy things that are happening in the world. How do we have an enduring solution using a language that fits for the different generations? Because that's the part of the problem. People are, language is quite interesting to look at. And in line with that, how do we have fair sharing? Because I think that's part of a feminist point of view. When you have politicians who see that as Marxist or leftist or whatever, and frame it in a negative connotation rather than the good of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And I think the attention to language is a very radical act because we have to unpack ideology, epistemology, dominant discourses, all of those things. So it is, we get a lot of unlearning and relearning achieved when we pay close attention to that. Malcolm, I see that you have your hand up. Did you want to offer a thought?
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks for your beautiful presentation. You know, as I sit here and listen and reflect on my positioning within this conversation as a male, I think back over the years of my community work and politicization, of being part of these conversations. And one of the things that I've thought deeply about is to reflect internally and acknowledge that within me, there are parts that I would call male and parts that I would call female, and that these thoughts have been recognized in, for example, Jungian psychology with the anima and animus, as well as in Eastern philosophy, in the yin and yang, for example. So I'm just wondering if there is room to bring a holistic frame into this conversation, such that people and especially men in a situation of male domination can break the dichotomy of male and female and recognize that this is more of a holistic concept. And where I think this may relate to eco struggles is to look out into the cosmos, into the environment, and see everything, every entity in the cosmos as possessing parts of female and male in whatever ways we think about those. So those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm, very much. I mean, they are interesting, and one of the slides I have on my slide deck is how to be an ally to intersectional feminists. So that would be something, and I think can, you know, come under what is the work of allies and so on. And I think also connecting to spirit is very powerful. But I think what's happening now is that there's a call for feminism to both do that work, but to actually to take a very deep understanding of connection and spirit and move politically and transform systems around it. So it is a deep dance, and but it's an important one. And I see comments from Holly and Joanna and also Sandra, and I think, for example, Joanna, I wonder if you want to say out loud too what you're thinking, but you're really raising an important point about where are the feminist engagements with missing and the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and around issues of reproductive justice and genocide, and an enduring critique of kind of mainstream feminism has been how white supremacist and how sort of liberal it has been in some ways, and has done a very good job about taking action on some axes of oppression, but not done a good job of engaging really meaningfully in anti-colonial and you know, institutionalized and state-sanctioned violence against Black and Indigenous and other people of color as a mainstream movement. It's being done in factions. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or move our conversation forward from the observation you're making, or whether it's good just the way it is.
Can you hear me? Yes,
yes.
It's Johanna. I'm just really concerned that when we don't pay attention to the way that women have been victims of violence to the point where, regardless of where that's happening, that we need to pay attention all the time to the undercurrents that are going on in our society that allow one woman to be killed in Canada every 6 days, and we don't even count the Indigenous women in that number. So it's just an affront to the holistic sense of where we live in this planet, where we belong, how do we connect? We connect to all of the humanity that's there, and deaths and genocide, and the way that's handled in so many different ways in terms of reproductive or the lack of reproductive justice, that allows women to be considered victims and targets. They're targeted, and we've done nothing to stop the targeting, and that, I think, is an affront to all of us. And that's sort of a sense of, we can talk ecofeminism, but if we don't talk about the genocide that's going on, we're theoretically in another planet in some ways. So that's all.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I think we have some very big work to do, and I think the embrace of intersectionality is changing the conversation a bit, but not changing enough the engagement that's happening under the banner of feminism. It's a very serious problem you're talking about, and takes very deep contemplation and engagement. And even using the word feminist in relation to these kinds of silences is re-traumatizing and painful. So that's partly what is happening when we have these conversations as well, I think. Sandra, I wonder if you wanted to say more about the comment that you've put into the chat box, which is building on this and very important for us to think about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been supporting the Missing and Murdered Women inquiry as a trauma practitioner for a few years now, and working with communities, working with leadership, working with the families that have been impacted by such tragedies that have been going on for a long time. And so we ran into, problems with the RCMP, whether we're out on the land, like we just shared, whether it's on the street in town, whether it's in our homes. And so largely it's men. And so we have this clash happening almost every day in our lives. Our children don't feel safe. And so this is a huge challenge for us in terms of community safety, in terms of well-being, and looking at our own systems of law, our own interest in peace. We come from this place of oneness, and there's supposed to be harmony there, yet because of genocide, because of oppression, our families, mostly our women, have been carrying that load for a long time. And it shows up in our well-being, or lack of well-being. And so we know that if we're in that disconnected place, that if we can find ways to bring families together beforehand, we can help them work through that big collective trauma and help set down some of that hurt, that pain, and grief. And then what can you do now? What is needed now for our families, for grandma, for the little ones, so that we can move forward in a good way and not be in this hurt place for too long, because we've been there long enough. Just taking care of the wound, and then hopefully, with collaboration, with allies, with partners, there's a commonality there to move forward. And that's kind of how I see it, and just listening and reflecting. Sorry.
Thank you. And I'm reminded, Johanna and Sandra, as you're talking, back to Shannon's comments, and how we began in the beginning of the day, and really thinking about not only is Indigenous sovereignty a way to embody sustainability, but what I'm hearing, is if feminism is going to make a contribution, that this work has to show up in these places, and that unlearning and relearning and engagement would have to happen. Otherwise, there's too much hurt and trauma and ignorance that's happened, even though there's great insight too, that is embodied in some feminist practice. But I think it's a very real question that feminism has to engage in. And then one of the questions for me as well is then what happens within, for example, the Anthropocene initiatives when feminism has to do this work, and what happens to voices that are even trying to grapple with these horrible histories, you know, and make them right. So I don't know, but I'm left contemplating, as I am often actually. What is the way forward, really?
Yeah. So I heard about sustainability. I heard about that holistic approach, you know, body, mind, and spirit. And we connect to the life force energy with the sacred life force. And that helps us, helps every single person.
Yeah.
It helps the land, it helps the water, it helps the ancestors. And that's the energy we want to lift up, we want to hold up, to get through these difficult times. You know, with big industry showing up in a big way, you know, how do we stand up to that? You know, when we rely on that life force, that sacredness to help us get through all that, the ceremony, the songs, the medicines, the water, and it helps us move forward. You know, and mental health programs can support that, you know, on the land, just berry picking in the afternoon with mom and babies. You know, there's simple ways to help facilitate that, and it's so helpful. Yes,
Well, thank you. And I'm aware that we have 1 minute and 38 seconds left. We have a wonderful question from Holly as well. Are there tools, resources to bring women together around eco-feminist collective thought and action? It can be very overwhelming to navigate the social justice landscape and find one's place and voice. So we have many questions we've opened up, which is actually expression of the kindness and generosity of you all. I wonder, Sandra, if you feel like you would like to report back from this group to the big group.
well, sure. Let's see, I have to read off the notes, if that's okay.
There's many notes, and I can see that Samantha's doing bullet points, but I think when you speak from your heart and experience, it's incredibly powerful as well. And I think we're left contemplating a very important question, and you've had the last word on it. That's really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You know, you can start to get involved at home. That's usually where it starts, eh? Where we live.
Thank you. We're going to get kicked out. You're right, Sandra. So get your wings on, because we're going to fly soon. But thank you for being here together, and to just opening, as basically we've taken the lid off the box, and it's been great.
Yes. Inside.
So it looks like we have another 50 seconds. So thank you, though, very much. And please feel free to connect with me if you have follow-up thoughts, questions, challenges, ideas. I feel like I really want these voices and thoughts to come back into the space of the Anthropocene, because I don't feel that they're totally there. And that that's important, that we're heard in those spaces. So good luck transitioning through the ether, and we'll see you on the other side.